Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of horror stories that you can listen to while you fall asleep. Before the video begins, let us know what time is it, and where you are listening from. Also, if you have suggestion for next horror story settings, let us know in the comments. Now let's begin. Sarah thought the small hole in her bathroom wall was just poor construction. She had no idea someone had been living in the crawl space above her ceiling for 8 months. In 2008, a college student in Japan named Sarah began noticing small things going wrong in her apartment. Food disappeared from her refrigerator. Her shower gel seemed to empty faster than it should. Sometimes she'd come home to find her bed slightly unmade, though she always made it before leaving. The toilet seat would be up when she distinctly remembered leaving it down. Her favorite mug would be in the sink, still warm to the touch. The landlord dismissed her concerns, suggesting she was simply forgetful due to stress from her studies. Her friends joked that she was losing her mind from too much studying, but Sarah knew something was wrong. She started keeping detailed notes about what she ate, what she used, where she placed things. The discrepancies were real and growing worse. She installed a security camera in her main room, hiding it behind some books, and left for her morning classes. When she reviewed the footage that evening, her blood ran cold. At 10:17 a.m., a middle-aged man had emerged from a cabinet in her kitchen, a space she thought was far too small for a person. He moved through her apartment with disturbing familiarity, opening her refrigerator and eating her leftover rice with his bare hands. He used her bathroom, brushed his teeth with her toothbrush, and then lay down in her bed, pulling her sheets up to his chin. The timestamp showed he'd been there for 6 hours, leaving only 20 minutes before she typically returned from classes. He knew her schedule perfectly. Police investigation revealed that Tatsuhiko Hirasaka, an unemployed 58-year-old man, had been living in the cramped space above her ceiling and inside her storage cabinets for nearly a year. He had created a network of hiding spots throughout the small apartment, surviving entirely on her food and watching her daily routines through carefully drilled holes in the walls. When officers arrested him, they found he had been keeping a detailed diary of Sarah's life. He knew when she showered, when she cried, when she talked to her boyfriend on the phone. He had recorded her most private moments and written disturbing fantasies about their relationship. In his twisted mind, they were living together as a couple. The most chilling detail, he had been there when she moved in. Her new apartment had never truly been hers alone. Every night she slept, every shower she took, every moment she thought she was safe and private, he had been there, watching from the darkness above her head. When 14-year-old Jenny agreed to babysit for the wealthy Caldwell family, she thought the hardest part would be getting little Emma to bed. She never expected to find the playroom that wasn't supposed to exist. The Caldwells lived in an imposing Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, the kind of house that appeared in architectural magazines. Dr. Marcus Caldwell was the town's most respected pediatrician, known for his gentle way with children. His wife Helen ran a charity foundation for missing children, organizing fundraisers and awareness campaigns. Their 6-year-old daughter Emma seemed sweet but unusually quiet, often staring off into space with an expression far too mature for her age. On Jenny's third night babysitting, Emma refused to go to sleep, insisting there were other children in the house who wanted to play with her. She kept pointing at the ceiling and whispering about friends who lived upstairs. Jenny dismissed it as typical childhood imagination until she heard distinct footsteps above them. Small, light steps like those of children running back and forth across the floor. The Caldwells had specifically told her never to go to the 3rd floor, claiming it was unsafe due to ongoing renovations and structural damage. But the sounds were coming from directly overhead, and they didn't sound like settling wood or pipes. They sounded like children playing. Against her better judgment, Jenny crept upstairs while Emma finally slept. The 3rd floor wasn't under renovation. Instead, she found a series of small rooms, each containing a child's bed, toys, and clothing. The rooms looked lived in but recently abandoned, with dusty handprints on the walls and old food containers scattered about. Children's drawings covered every surface, disturbing images of needles, crying faces, and figures in white coats. Photographs covered one entire wall, showing Dr. Caldwell with various children, none of whom looked like Emma. The children in the photos appeared drugged or sedated, their eyes vacant and unfocused. In the largest room, Jenny discovered a collection of missing person flyers dating back 15 years, all featuring children between ages 5 and 8 who had disappeared from neighboring towns. In the corner, she found Dr. Caldwell's detailed journal, documenting behavioral modifications and subject responses to various stimuli. The entries described systematic torture disguised as medical experiments, designed to break the children's will and make them compliant. Emma wasn't his daughter, she was his most recent victim, the only one who had survived long enough to be adopted into his cover story. Jenny grabbed Emma and ran, calling police from her car. The investigation revealed that Dr. Caldwell had been abducting children for over a decade, using his medical practice to identify vulnerable targets. The other children's remains were found buried throughout the mansion's extensive grounds. Melissa loved working the night shift at Sunset Manor Nursing Home because it was peaceful and quiet. The residents slept soundly, and she could catch up on paperwork. She never wondered why the previous night nurse had quit so suddenly, or why no one would work alone. Melissa had been working at the nursing home for 3 weeks when she noticed an odd pattern in the resident deaths. They always happened on her nights off, never during her shifts. When she mentioned this observation to her supervisor, the woman's face went pale and she quickly changed the subject, muttering something about coincidences and bad luck coming in waves. Then Melissa started paying closer attention to her co-worker, Dale Thompson, who had worked the night shift for 12 years. He was beloved by families, always volunteering for extra hours and seeming genuinely caring toward the residents. But Melissa noticed he spent an unusual amount of time in the rooms of the sickest patients, often emerging with strange, satisfied smiles on his face. One night, she watched from the hallway as Dale entered the room of Mrs. Patterson, an 89-year-old woman recovering from pneumonia. Through the cracked door, she saw him lean over the sleeping woman and place his hands firmly over her nose and mouth. Mrs. Patterson's frail arms flailed weakly before going completely still. Dale held his position for several more minutes, checking her pulse, before calmly adjusting her blankets and pillows to make everything look natural. Melissa stood frozen in horror as Dale made detailed notes in Mrs. Patterson's chart about her peaceful passing during sleep, then walked out of the room whistling softly to himself. He spent the next hour calling Mrs. Patterson's family with condolences, his voice perfectly conveying grief and sympathy. The next morning, Mrs. Patterson's death was attributed to complications from her illness. Dale comforted the family, helped arrange the funeral, and even attended the service. It was a scene he had repeated 127 times over his 12 years at Sunset Manor. When Melissa finally reported what she'd witnessed, the investigation revealed that Dale had been systematically murdering residents he deemed ready to go. He chose victims who were elderly, sick, and had fewer visitors, people whose deaths wouldn't be questioned. He justified his actions as mercy killings, but investigators found detailed notes where he described the intoxicating power he felt watching the life drain from their eyes. The nursing home had unknowingly employed one of the most prolific serial killers in the state's history. Families who thought their loved ones had died peacefully learned they had been murdered by the very man they'd trusted to provide comfort in their final moments. When Lisa matched with David on the dating app, his profile seemed perfect, handsome, successful, and charming. She never saw the screenshots he was taking of their conversations, or knew that her address was already written in his notebook labeled Project 14. Lisa Chun was cautious about online dating, always meeting in public places and telling friends her location. David Morrison seemed different from other matches, articulate, respectful, and genuinely interested in getting to know her beyond superficial topics. His profile showed him volunteering at animal shelters and hiking scenic trails. After 3 successful coffee dates where he displayed perfect gentleman behavior, she agreed to let him pick her up for dinner at what he claimed was his favorite restaurant. David arrived at her apartment complex in an expensive BMW, impeccably dressed and carrying a bouquet of her favorite flowers, information he'd somehow remembered from casual conversation. He was even more charming in person than over text, complimenting her appearance and asking thoughtful questions about her day. But as they drove toward the restaurant, Lisa noticed they were heading away from downtown, toward a more industrial area filled with abandoned warehouses. When she questioned the route, David's demeanor shifted instantly. His warm smile disappeared, replaced by cold, calculating eyes. His voice became mechanical and emotionless. "We're not going to dinner, Lisa," he said simply, doors locking with an electronic click. "We're going somewhere much more private, where we can really get to know each other." David drove Lisa to an abandoned warehouse he had prepared months in advance. Inside were restraints, surgical tools arranged with medical precision, and professional video equipment set up to record everything from multiple angles. He had done this before many times. Lisa was meant to be victim number 14 in what he called his dating experiment, a systematic study of human fear and pain responses. What David didn't know was that Lisa had shared her live location with her roommate through a safety app they'd agreed to use for all first dates. When she didn't check in with the predetermined code word at the agreed time, her roommate immediately tracked her phone to the warehouse location and called police. Officers arrived to find Lisa chained in a soundproofed room, while David calmly set up his camera equipment, completely confident in his routine. The warehouse contained evidence of 13 other women who hadn't been as fortunate or prepared. David had been using multiple dating profiles across different apps and cities, targeting women who lived alone and had fewer family connections to notice their disappearance quickly. His phone contained hundreds of screenshots of conversations with potential victims, along with detailed psychological profiles and notes about their schedules, fears, and how long they might be missed if they vanished. When the Hendersons moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood, everyone thought they were the perfect family. The neighbors had no idea that the soundproof basement beneath their manicured lawn contained 17 years of unspeakable horrors. Detective Maria Santos had seen plenty of crime scenes in her 20-year career, but nothing prepared her for what she found at 1247 Maple Street on that gray October morning in 2019. The call had come in as a routine wellness check. Neighbors were concerned because they hadn't seen the Henderson family's youngest daughter, Amy, playing in the yard for several weeks. The Hendersons were model citizens in Willowbrook, a picture-perfect suburb where nothing bad ever happened. Robert Henderson was a respected accountant who coached Little League on weekends. His wife Susan volunteered at the local food bank and organized neighborhood watch meetings. Their 3 children, Michael, 16, Sarah, 14, and Amy, 12, were honor roll students who never caused trouble. When no one answered the door despite cars in the driveway, Detective Santos obtained a warrant. The house was immaculate, almost sterile in its cleanliness. Family photos lined the walls showing happy moments at Disney World, birthday parties, and school graduations. Everything appeared normal until Santos noticed something odd. There were no recent photos of Amy anywhere in the house. In Amy's bedroom, Santos found clothes that hadn't been worn in months, a bed that hadn't been slept in, and a thick layer of dust on everything. But what made her blood run cold was finding Amy's school backpack hidden in her parents' closet, along with a withdrawal letter dated 3 months earlier claiming the family was moving to California for Robert's job transfer. The family was clearly still living in the house, but where was Amy? Santos began questioning the neighbors more thoroughly. Mrs. Chun from across the street mentioned that she used to hear Amy practicing piano every afternoon, but the music had stopped months ago. The mailman said he'd noticed the family had started intercepting mail before it reached the box. Most disturbing, the grocery delivery driver reported that Susan Henderson had recently started ordering much smaller quantities of food, enough for 4 people instead of 5. When Santos confronted the family, their behavior became increasingly erratic. Robert's hands shook as he insisted Amy was visiting her grandmother in Arizona. Susan's story kept changing. First Amy was at summer camp, then staying with a cousin, then studying abroad. The 2 older children, Michael and Sarah, wouldn't make eye contact and seemed terrified of their parents. But it was something Michael whispered when his parents briefly left the room that changed everything. "Check the basement. Please. She's been down there so long." The basement door was secured with 3 different locks and a security system that seemed excessive for a suburban home. When Santos finally gained access, she discovered that what appeared to be a normal basement from the outside was actually a sophisticated prison. The space had been divided into multiple cells, each with reinforced walls and heavy metal doors. One cell was clearly designed for a child. It contained Amy's missing belongings, a mattress on the floor, and walls covered in desperate scratch marks where she had tried to claw her way out. The smell was overwhelming. human waste, fear, and something else Santos couldn't immediately identify. But Amy's cell was empty. In the main area of the basement, Santos found evidence of something far worse than imprisonment. There were surgical tools, video recording equipment, and detailed journals documenting 17 years of systematic torture and murder. The Hendersons hadn't just imprisoned Amy. They had been abducting, torturing, and killing children for nearly 2 decades. The journals revealed the horrifying truth. The Henderson family weren't just serial killers. They were a family business of death. Robert would identify potential victims through his work with youth sports leagues. Susan would befriend the families and learn their routines. Even the older children, Michael and Sarah, had been trained from early ages to help lure victims and dispose of evidence. Amy hadn't been their victim. She had been their accomplice until she tried to escape their twisted family business. When she threatened to tell authorities about what they did to other children in the basement, her own parents had turned her into their prisoner. The video recordings were the most damning evidence. Hours upon hours of footage showing the systematic torture of dozens of children over the years. The Henderson family had developed elaborate games and experiments designed to maximize psychological and physical suffering. They had been selling these videos online to other predators around the world, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit from children's agony. Santos found evidence of at least 37 victims over 17 years. The Hendersons had perfected their system. They targeted children from troubled homes or foster care, kids who wouldn't be missed immediately or whose disappearances could be explained away. They would keep victims for weeks or months, documenting every moment of their suffering before finally killing them. The bodies were disposed of using Robert's knowledge of local construction sites. He had connections throughout the county and knew exactly when foundations were being poured or lots were being developed. Dozens of children were literally cemented into the infrastructure of their own community. When police finally located Amy, she was being held in a storage unit across town, barely alive after months of imprisonment and torture by her own family. She had been their longest surviving victim because she knew their methods and could anticipate their moves. But even she couldn't escape the basement they had specially designed for her. The arrest of the Henderson family sent shockwaves through Willowbrook. Neighbors who had trusted them with their own children, who had invited them to barbecues and block parties, learned they had been living next door to one of the most prolific family serial killing operations in American history. The most chilling detail emerged during the trial. The Hendersons had been planning to recruit other neighborhood families into their operation. Police found detailed surveillance notes on dozens of local children, along with plans to gradually introduce trusted neighbors to their hobby and expand their network of accomplices. Michael and Sarah Henderson, despite being minors, were found to have actively participated in multiple murders. Court psychologists determined they had been so thoroughly indoctrinated into their family's twisted worldview that they genuinely believed torturing and killing children was normal behavior. The case revealed something that haunts Detective Santos to this day. Evil doesn't always hide in shadows or look like the monsters in movies. Sometimes it lives in the house next door, coaches your child's baseball team, and organizes charity drives for missing children. When Dr. Elena Morrison was found dead in her locked office at St. Mary's Hospital, everyone assumed it was suicide from the stress of her demanding job. No one thought to check the encrypted files on her computer, files that documented 15 years of turning her patients into unwilling test subjects. The call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 2018. Hospital security had found Dr. Elena Morrison slumped over her desk in her office, a bottle of sleeping pills beside her, and what appeared to be a suicide note typed on her computer screen. She was the head of the pediatric oncology ward at St. Mary's Children's Hospital in Seattle, beloved by families and respected by colleagues for her innovative treatment approaches and remarkable success rates with terminal cases. Detective James Park was assigned what seemed like a routine case. Dr. Morrison had been working 18-hour days, dealing with dying children and desperate parents. The suicide note mentioned the overwhelming burden of losing so many young patients despite her best efforts. Everything pointed to a dedicated doctor who had finally cracked under the emotional weight of her profession. But Park noticed something odd during his initial investigation. Dr. Morrison's office was equipped with security cameras that should have recorded her final hours, but the footage from that night was mysteriously corrupted. More strange was the fact that Morrison had died from a lethal injection of potassium chloride, a drug that would cause instant cardiac arrest. Yet the suicide note claimed she had taken sleeping pills. When Park examined Morrison's computer more thoroughly, he discovered that her hard drive had been professionally wiped just hours before her death. Someone with advanced technical knowledge had attempted to destroy all her files. But Morrison had been paranoid about data loss and maintained multiple encrypted backup drives hidden throughout her office. What Park found on those drives changed everything he thought he knew about the respected pediatric oncologist. For 15 years, Dr. Morrison had been conducting unauthorized medical experiments on her young cancer patients. But these weren't crude, obvious violations. They were sophisticated, long-term studies designed to test the limits of human suffering and the effectiveness of various torture techniques disguised as cutting-edge cancer treatments. Morrison's files contained detailed documentation of hundreds of children who had been subjected to experimental procedures that had nothing to do with treating their cancer. She had been systematically poisoning children with various substances to study their reactions, performing unnecessary surgeries to test pain tolerance, and deliberately prolonging their suffering to observe psychological breakdown patterns. The most horrifying discovery was Morrison's collaboration with a network of doctors across the country who were conducting similar experiments. They had created a sophisticated system for sharing data, trading patients, and covering up their activities. Morrison's hospital was just one node in a nationwide network of medical professionals who had turned children's cancer wards into laboratories for studying human torture. The encrypted files revealed Morrison's true motivation. She was developing techniques for a government contractor specializing in enhanced interrogation methods. The children in her care were being used to test which combinations of drugs, pain, and psychological pressure would be most effective for breaking adult prisoners without leaving obvious evidence of torture. Morrison had been paid millions of dollars over the years to provide detailed reports on which methods caused the most psychological damage, which drugs could simulate natural illness while causing maximum suffering, and how long children could endure various forms of agony before permanent mental breakdown occurred. Park discovered that Morrison had specifically targeted children from poor families, foster care, and undocumented immigrants, kids whose parents were less likely to question her treatment methods or had limited ability to seek second opinions. She had perfected a system of convincing desperate parents that their children needed experimental treatments that were their only hope for survival. The suicide note on Morrison's computer had been fake. The real story emerged from her encrypted communications with her government contacts. Morrison had been preparing to expose the entire network because she had discovered that some of her fellow conspirators were planning to expand their operations to include healthy children from middle-class families, a move Morrison considered too risky. Her death hadn't been suicide. It had been an assassination carried out by her own network to prevent her from revealing their activities. The killer had been another doctor in the conspiracy, someone with access to the hospital and knowledge of Morrison's routines. As Park dug deeper, he uncovered evidence that the conspiracy reached much higher than individual doctors. Hospital administrators, pharmaceutical companies, and government agencies had all been involved in facilitating and covering up the experiments. Morrison's remarkable success rate with terminal cancer patients hadn't been due to her medical brilliance. It had been because she was deliberately selecting children who weren't actually terminal, then slowly killing them while documenting the process. The investigation revealed that hundreds of children who had died in Morrison's care over the years hadn't died from cancer. They had been murdered through systematic medical torture disguised as treatment. Parents who had trusted Morrison with their children's lives had unknowingly handed them over to a monster who saw them as nothing more than test subjects. The most chilling aspect of Morrison's files was her detailed psychological profiles of the parents. She had studied which families would be most compliant, which parents could be manipulated through guilt and false hope, and how to isolate families from other medical opinions. She had turned the natural desperation of parents facing their child's illness into a weapon for recruiting victims. Morrison's network had been operating for over 2 decades, with dozens of doctors in major hospitals across the country participating in the conspiracy. They had developed elaborate protocols for sharing victims, covering up deaths, and maintaining their cover stories. The conspiracy had its own internal review board that approved which children could be selected for which experiments. When Park finally arrested the other conspirators, the scope of the horror became clear. Over 3,000 children had been tortured and murdered in the name of medical research that was actually designed to perfect techniques for breaking human beings. The conspiracy had generated detailed manuals on psychological torture that were being used by interrogators around the world. The most devastating revelation came during the trials. Many of the experimental treatments Morrison had subjected children to had no medical purpose whatsoever. She had simply wanted to see how much suffering a child could endure before death. Some experiments involved keeping children conscious and aware while slowly poisoning them. Others involved psychological torture designed to drive them insane before killing them. Parents who had spent years grieving what they thought were tragic but natural deaths learned that their children had been systematically tortured by the very doctor they had trusted to save them. Families who had established memorial funds in Morrison's honor discovered that the woman they had praised as a saint had been documenting their children's final agonized moments for the entertainment of sadistic government contractors. The conspiracy had hidden behind the natural tragedy of childhood cancer, using parents' grief and desperation as cover for crimes so monstrous that most people couldn't comprehend their scope. The doctors involved had counted on the fact that no one would question the death of a child who was already sick, and that grieving parents would be too devastated to demand thorough investigations. Detective Park never fully recovered from the case. The knowledge that such systematic evil could hide behind the white coats and caring smiles of trusted medical professionals shattered his faith in the institutions designed to protect society's most vulnerable members. When beloved high school teacher Mr. Kenneth Walsh was named Teacher of the Year for the third time, parents lined up to get their children into his advanced psychology class. They had no idea that his basement contained detailed files on every student he'd taught over 22 years, and that 12 of those students had never made it to graduation. The first sign something was wrong came when 17-year-old Jessica Chin stopped coming home after her Tuesday evening study sessions with Mr. Walsh. Her parents weren't immediately concerned. Kenneth Walsh was Riverside High School's most respected teacher, known for going above and beyond to help struggling students. He often tutored kids for free at his home, and dozens of former students credited him with turning their lives around. When Jessica's parents called the school after she missed 3 days of classes, they learned something that made their blood run cold. There were no Tuesday evening study sessions scheduled. In fact, Jessica had been marked absent every Tuesday for the past 6 weeks, though she had been leaving home at the regular time, telling her parents she was going to Mr. Walsh's house for extra help with her college applications. Detective Sarah Rodriguez was called in when Jessica's car was found abandoned in the parking lot of an office complex 20 miles from town. Jessica's purse was still inside, along with her phone and a notebook filled with what appeared to be session notes from meetings with Mr. Walsh. But these weren't academic notes. They were detailed psychological profiles of Jessica's fears, insecurities, and family relationships. When Rodriguez questioned Walsh, he appeared genuinely concerned about Jessica's disappearance. He confirmed that he had been tutoring her, but claimed their last session had been 2 weeks earlier. He provided detailed alibis for the days she had been missing, and even volunteered to help with the search efforts. His colleagues and the school administration vouched for his character without hesitation. But Rodriguez noticed something odd about Walsh's home when she conducted a routine interview there. Despite being a psychology teacher for over 2 decades, his house contained no personal photos, no mementos from grateful students, none of the usual keepsakes that dedicated teachers typically accumulated. The house felt more like a carefully constructed stage set than someone's actual home. More disturbing was what Rodriguez found when she ran a background check on Walsh's former students. Over his 22-year teaching career, 12 students had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. All had been enrolled in his advanced psychology class. All had been receiving private tutoring from Walsh in the weeks before their disappearances. The pattern was sophisticated and had gone unnoticed because Walsh spread his activities across multiple school districts. He would teach at a school for 3 to 4 years, select certain students for his attention, then transfer to a new district before any patterns could be detected. School administrators were always sorry to lose such a dedicated teacher and provided glowing recommendations that helped him secure new positions. Rodriguez obtained a warrant to search Walsh's basement and discovered something that defied comprehension. Walsh had constructed what could only be described as a psychological torture laboratory. The space was divided into multiple rooms, each designed to break down human psychology through different methods. One room was a sensory deprivation chamber, where victims could be isolated in complete darkness and silence for weeks. Another was equipped with speakers and screens for subjecting prisoners to constant psychological bombardment, repeating their worst fears and insecurities back to them in endless loops. A third room contained medical equipment for administering drugs that would enhance fear responses and prevent victims from losing consciousness during their ordeals. But the most horrifying discovery was Walsh's computer system, which contained 22 years of detailed psychological profiles on every student he had ever taught. Walsh had been using his position as a teacher to conduct in-depth psychological evaluations of hundreds of teenagers, identifying which ones would make the most interesting subjects for his experiments. His files revealed the true purpose of his extra help sessions. Walsh had been systematically studying adolescent psychology to perfect methods of mental torture. He would identify students with specific psychological vulnerabilities, depression, anxiety, family trauma, low self-esteem, then use his position of trust and authority to gradually manipulate them into increasingly isolated situations. Walsh's basement contained video recordings of his experiments spanning 2 decades. He had been documenting the complete psychological breakdown of dozens of teenagers, studying which techniques were most effective at destroying their sense of reality and will to live. The recordings showed sophisticated psychological torture designed to drive victims insane while keeping them physically unharmed. Walsh's basement contained video recordings of his experiments spanning 2 decades. He had been documenting the complete psychological breakdown of dozens of teenagers, studying which techniques were most effective at destroying their sense of reality and will to live. The recordings showed sophisticated psychological torture designed to drive victims insane while keeping them physically unharmed. The investigation revealed that Walsh had been selling his research to various organizations interested in psychological manipulation techniques. His detailed studies of adolescent psychological breaking points had been used to develop enhanced interrogation methods, cult recruitment strategies, and even more effective advertising techniques targeting teenagers. Rodriguez discovered that Walsh had perfected a system for selecting victims who wouldn't be missed immediately. He targeted students from troubled homes, foster children, or teens whose parents were going through divorces or other family crises. He had an uncanny ability to identify which families were too distracted or dysfunctional to notice gradual changes in their children's behavior. The most chilling aspect of Walsh's operation was how he had weaponized the natural trust between teachers and students. He would begin by genuinely helping students with their problems, providing real psychological support and academic assistance. This established a bond of trust and dependency that he would then exploit to gradually isolate his victims from other support systems. Walsh had developed elaborate psychological profiles that allowed him to predict exactly how each student would respond to different types of pressure. He knew which students could be manipulated through guilt, which ones through fear, and which ones through false promises of acceptance and understanding. He had turned teaching into a hunting ground for psychological predators. When Rodriguez finally found Jessica, she was in the basement's main torture chamber, strapped to a chair and surrounded by speakers that had been playing recordings of her own voice confessing her deepest fears and insecurities for weeks on end. Walsh had been conducting an experiment to see how long it would take to completely shatter her sense of identity, using only her own psychological vulnerabilities against her. The basement also contained the remains of the 12 students who had disappeared over the years. Walsh had kept detailed notes on how long each victim had survived his psychological torture before their minds completely broke. Most had died from the physical stress of prolonged terror and psychological breakdown, though some had been driven to suicide as part of Walsh's experiments on the limits of human despair. The investigation revealed that Walsh had been in contact with a network of educators across the country who were conducting similar experiments. They had been sharing techniques, trading victims, and collaborating on research projects designed to perfect methods of psychological control and manipulation. The conspiracy had been operating for over 3 decades, with dozens of teachers using their classrooms as recruiting grounds for human test subjects. During his trial, Walsh showed no remorse for his actions. He maintained that his research had been scientifically valuable and claimed that the students he had tortured should be considered martyrs to the advancement of psychological science. He expressed frustration that his work had been interrupted before he could complete his studies on the complete psychological destruction of the human personality. The most devastating revelation came when investigators realized that hundreds of Walsh's former students who had survived their encounters with him were walking around with carefully implanted psychological programming. Walsh had been conducting long-term experiments on many students without their knowledge, planting specific fears and behavioral triggers that he could activate years later to study the long-term effects of his manipulation techniques. The landlord's key. When Amanda found the perfect apartment at half the market price, she thought she'd hit the lottery. The landlord seemed like such a kind old man, always concerned about her safety and well-being. She never questioned why he insisted on keeping spare keys to all the locks, or why her apartment had so many unusually placed security cameras. Amanda Martinez had been searching for an affordable apartment in downtown Portland for months, when she stumbled across the listing that seemed too good to be true. A spacious one-bedroom in a beautiful Victorian building for $800 a month, less than half what similar places were renting for. When she met the landlord, 67-year-old Harold Vance, he seemed like a godsend, grandfatherly, concerned about her safety as a young woman living alone, and willing to waive the security deposit if she could move in immediately. Vance owned the entire building, which housed 12 units filled with young professional women. He explained that he preferred female tenants because they were cleaner and more responsible. He took pride in maintaining the building personally and insisted on having spare keys to every apartment for emergency maintenance. Amanda was so grateful to find affordable housing that she didn't question why the lease required her to provide detailed personal information, including her work schedule, family contacts, and medical history. The first few months were perfect. Vance was attentive without being intrusive, often leaving small gifts outside her door, flowers, homemade cookies, or little notes expressing his concern for her well-being. When Amanda's car broke down, he offered to drive her to work. When she mentioned feeling unsafe walking alone at night, he installed additional security cameras in the hallways for all the tenants' protection. But Amanda began noticing strange things around her apartment. Items would be moved slightly from where she'd left them. Her underwear drawers seemed to be reorganized periodically. Sometimes she'd come home to find her bed made differently than how she'd left it in the morning. When she mentioned these concerns to Vance, he was sympathetic and suggested she might be stressed from her new job. The breaking point came when Amanda installed a hidden camera in her own apartment after finding clear evidence that someone had been inside while she was at work. The footage revealed Harold Vance entering her apartment almost daily, spending hours going through her personal belongings, photographing her clothes and intimate items, and installing tiny cameras in places she would never think to look. Detective Lisa Chong was called when Amanda reported the break-ins, but what she discovered went far beyond simple voyeurism. Vance hadn't just been spying on Amanda. He had been conducting elaborate surveillance on all 12 female tenants for over 15 years, documenting their most private moments and selling the footage to online networks of sexual predators. Chang's investigation revealed that Vance had constructed the entire building as a sophisticated spy operation. Every apartment was equipped with hidden cameras in the bedrooms, bathrooms, and living areas. The building's ventilation system had been modified to allow him to pump sedatives into individual apartments, ensuring tenants would sleep deeply while he conducted more invasive activities. Vance had been drugging his tenants regularly, entering their apartments while they were unconscious, and subjecting them to various forms of sexual assault that they would never remember. He had perfected a system of using date-rape drugs that left no memory of the attacks, but caused his victims to experience unexplained physical discomfort and psychological distress that he would then offer to help them with as their concerned landlord. The basement of the building contained a control room that looked like something from a high-tech surveillance operation. Vance had monitors showing live feeds from every apartment, detailed files on each tenant's daily routines, and computer systems for editing and distributing the footage he collected. He had been running what amounted to a commercial sexual exploitation operation, disguised as a rental property. Chong discovered that Vance had specifically targeted young women who were new to the city, financially vulnerable, or socially isolated. He would advertise his apartments at below-market rates to attract tenants who couldn't afford other options and would be less likely to move out if they experienced problems. His lease agreements contained clauses that made it financially devastating for tenants to break their contracts early. The investigation revealed that over 200 women had lived in Vance's building over the years, and every single one had been victimized without their knowledge. Vance had documented thousands of hours of footage showing women in their most private moments, and had been selling access to this material through underground networks that paid premium prices for authentic, voyeuristic content featuring unsuspecting victims. But Vance's operation went beyond passive observation. Chong found evidence that he had been conducting psychological experiments on his tenants, manipulating their environment to study their responses to stress, fear, and isolation. He would create problems in their apartments, strange noises, temperature fluctuations, minor flooding, then observe how they coped with the stress while positioning himself as their helpful protector. Vance had developed detailed psychological profiles of each tenant, studying their vulnerabilities and designing specific manipulation techniques for each woman. He knew which ones could be controlled through financial pressure, which ones through emotional manipulation, and which ones through deliberate psychological destabilization that made them depend on him for support. The most horrifying discovery was Vance's graduation system. When tenants became too suspicious or showed signs of discovering his activities, he would escalate to more direct forms of assault and eventually murder. Chong found evidence of at least 8 women who had died in the building over the years, with their deaths carefully staged to look like accidents, suicides, or natural causes. Vance had perfected methods of killing tenants in ways that wouldn't trigger investigations. He used his knowledge of their medical histories, gathered from their lease applications, to cause deaths that could be attributed to existing health conditions. Women with anxiety disorders would die from apparent heart attacks caused by drugs that mimicked panic responses. Those with depression would be found having apparently committed suicide using methods that matched their psychological profiles. The building's other tenants were shocked to learn that their helpful, grandfatherly landlord had been systematically violating them for years. Many reported experiencing unexplained health issues, memory problems, and psychological distress that they now realized had been deliberately caused by Vance's chemical manipulations of their environment. Chang's investigation revealed that Vance was part of a network of property owners across the country who were running similar operations. They shared techniques for selecting victims, methods for avoiding detection, and even traded tenants between properties when women became too suspicious of their activities. The conspiracy had been operating for decades, with hundreds of properties serving as hunting grounds for systematic sexual exploitation. During the search of Vance's personal residence, investigators found his detailed journals documenting 15 years of crimes. He had written extensively about his techniques for psychological manipulation, his methods for administering drugs without detection, and his analysis of which types of women made the best long-term victims. He had treated the systematic violation of vulnerable women as a scientific experiment, meticulously documenting every aspect of his crimes. The journals also revealed Vance's future plans. He had been preparing to expand his operation by purchasing additional buildings and recruiting other property owners to join his network. He had developed training materials for other landlords interested in exploiting their tenants, and had been actively working to establish similar operations in other cities. When Vance was finally arrested, he showed no remorse for his actions. He maintained that he had been providing affordable housing to women who couldn't find it elsewhere, and claimed they should be grateful for his generosity. He expressed frustration that his research into female psychology and sexuality had been interrupted before he could complete his studies. The most devastating aspect of the case was realizing how many warning signs had been ignored over the years. Multiple tenants had reported strange experiences to friends and family, but because Vance had such a reputation as a kind and helpful landlord, their concerns had been dismissed as paranoia or stress. The very traits that made him appear trustworthy, his concern for their safety, his attentiveness to their needs, his willingness to help with their problems, had been carefully calculated manipulations designed to maintain access to his victims. When Camp Wildwood opened its doors in 1987, parents couldn't wait to send their children to experience the character-building wilderness adventure that director Thomas Bradley promised. What they didn't know was that Bradley had specifically chosen the remote location because screams couldn't be heard for miles, and that the camp's isolation program was designed to break children's spirits before anyone noticed they were missing. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in August 2003. Mrs. Patricia Hendricks was expecting to hear from her 13-year-old son Danny, who had been attending Camp Wildwood for 3 weeks. Instead, she received a call from camp director Thomas Bradley explaining that Danny had run away during a nighttime hiking exercise and was missing in the surrounding wilderness. Bradley's voice was perfectly calibrated, concerned but calm, professional yet caring. He explained that search teams were already combing the forest and that local authorities had been notified. He assured Mrs. Hendricks that runaway incidents were unfortunately common at wilderness camps, especially with children who were struggling to adapt to the program's disciplinary structure. But something about the call troubled Mrs. Hendricks. Danny had never run away from anything in his life. He was an Eagle Scout who loved outdoor activities and had been excited about attending the camp. When she pressed Bradley for more details about the circumstances of Danny's disappearance, his answers became evasive and contradictory. Detective Robert Mason was assigned to the missing person case, expecting to find another teenager who had gotten lost in the woods and would turn up within a day or two. Camp Wildwood had an excellent reputation. It was expensive, exclusive, and marketed to wealthy families as a premier wilderness experience that would teach their children self-reliance and discipline. But when Mason arrived at the camp, he immediately noticed something wrong. The facility was immaculately maintained, almost militaristically organized, but there were no children visible anywhere. Bradley explained that the other campers were on extended wilderness expeditions, part of the camp's intensive survival training program. Mason's suspicions deepened when he asked to see the camp's records and found that Danny Hendricks was the only camper currently registered. When pressed about the whereabouts of other children, Bradley produced a complex schedule showing different groups on various wilderness excursions, but couldn't provide specific locations or contact information for any of the supervising counselors. The breakthrough came when Mason discovered that Camp Wildwood had been operating for 16 years, but had never been inspected by state authorities. Bradley had obtained all necessary permits and licenses through what appeared to be legitimate channels, but closer investigation revealed that many of the regulatory officials who had approved the camp's operations were either fictional or had died years earlier. Mason obtained a warrant to search the entire facility and made a discovery that defied comprehension. The camp's underground bunker system, supposedly built for emergency shelter, actually contained a network of cells where children had been imprisoned for extended periods. The bunkers were soundproofed and equipped with surveillance equipment, one-way mirrors, and medical restraint systems. Bradley hadn't been running a summer camp. He had been operating a systematic child abuse laboratory disguised as a wilderness program. Over 16 years, he had abducted and tortured over 400 children, using the camp's isolation and his reputation as a youth development expert to avoid suspicion from parents and authorities. The investigation revealed Bradley's sophisticated system for selecting victims. He targeted children from wealthy families going through divorces, families dealing with behavioral problems, or parents who wanted to send their children away for discipline. These parents were often relieved to have someone else handle their difficult children for extended periods and didn't question lack of communication from the camp. Bradley had developed elaborate stories to explain why children couldn't contact their families during their stay. He claimed that part of the program's effectiveness came from complete separation from outside influences, allowing children to focus on personal growth without distractions. Parents were told that emergency-only contact policies were essential for the character-building process. The camp's financial records revealed that Bradley had been charging parents premium rates for programs that never existed. Families paid thousands of dollars for their children to attend wilderness expeditions, leadership training, and specialized therapy sessions that were actually systematic torture designed to break the children's psychological resistance. Mason found detailed documentation of Bradley's experiments in child psychology and behavioral modification. He had been studying how different types of trauma affected developing minds, testing which combination of physical abuse, psychological manipulation, and isolation would produce the most compliant victims. The children weren't campers. They were test subjects in elaborate studies of human breaking points. The bunker system contained evidence of sophisticated torture techniques that Bradley had refined over years of practice. He had developed methods for inflicting maximum psychological damage while leaving minimal physical evidence, allowing him to return children to their families with trauma that could be dismissed as adjustment difficulties or typical teenage behavioral problems. But not all children survived Bradley's experiments. Mason discovered a mass grave site containing the remains of 127 children who had died during their stay at Camp Wildwood. Bradley had perfected techniques for disposing of bodies and had developed cover stories explaining their disappearances. Claims that children had run away, been killed in wilderness accidents, or had been transferred to other programs. The investigation revealed that Bradley had been selling detailed psychological profiles and behavioral modification techniques to various organizations interested in controlling human behavior. His research on breaking children's will and rebuilding their personalities according to specific parameters had been used to develop more effective brainwashing techniques for military and intelligence applications. Bradley's operation included a network of accomplices who helped maintain the camp's cover story. Fake counselors, fraudulent references, and elaborate documentation had been created to support the illusion that Camp Wildwood was a legitimate wilderness program. Some accomplices were parents whose own children had been killed by Bradley, but who had been manipulated into believing their children had died in accidents. The most chilling discovery was Bradley's long-term planning for expanding his operation. He had been working to establish similar camps in other states, and had been training other individuals to run facilities using his methods. Mason found evidence of at least 12 other locations where Bradley's associates were conducting similar operations under the guise of therapeutic wilderness programs. When Mason finally located Danny Hendricks, the boy was found in one of the deepest bunkers, subjected to months of systematic psychological torture designed to completely restructure his personality. Bradley had been conducting an experiment to see if he could turn a well-adjusted child into a completely obedient follower by breaking down his sense of identity and rebuilding it according to predetermined specifications. Danny's rescue revealed the full scope of Bradley's current operation. There were 43 children currently imprisoned in the bunker system, ranging in age from 8 to 16. All had been reported to their parents as participating in various wilderness activities, while actually being subjected to daily torture sessions designed to study their psychological breaking points. The children who survived Bradley's experiments were found to have been systematically programmed with specific behavioral triggers and psychological responses. Bradley had been conducting long-term studies on mind control, using the children as subjects to perfect techniques for creating completely controllable human beings who would follow orders without question. During his trial, Bradley maintained that his work had been scientifically valuable and claimed that the children he had tortured should be considered volunteers in advancing human understanding of psychological development. He expressed frustration that his research had been interrupted before he could complete his studies on the complete reconstruction of human personality through controlled trauma. The Camp Wildwood case revealed how easily predators could exploit parental desires to help their children while hiding behind professional credentials and institutional respectability. Bradley had weaponized parents' love for their children, turning their desire to provide growth opportunities into a recruitment system for systematic abuse disguised as character development. When Margaret Foster was promoted to Senior Child Protective Services investigator, her colleagues praised her dedication to saving vulnerable children from abusive homes. What they didn't know was that Foster had been systematically placing those children into situations far worse than anything they had escaped, and that her emergency foster network was actually a sophisticated trafficking operation that had been operating for 12 years. The first red flag should have been the statistics. In Margaret Foster's district, child removal rates had increased by 340% over her 8-year tenure, while successful family reunifications had dropped to nearly zero. But Foster's superiors saw these numbers as evidence of her thorough work in a particularly troubled area of the city. She consistently identified abuse and neglect that other investigators had missed, and her detailed reports always justified the urgent removal of children from their homes. Detective Anthony Rivera was assigned to investigate when 3 separate families filed complaints alleging that Foster had fabricated evidence to remove their children. The families claimed that Foster had manipulated their words, staged photographs, and coerced children into making false statements about abuse that had never occurred. But Foster's reputation was impeccable. She had been named Social Worker of the Year twice, and was frequently called upon to train new investigators. What Rivera discovered when he began examining Foster's cases was a pattern of behavior that defied comprehension. Over 12 years, Foster had removed 847 children from their homes, but departmental records showed that fewer than 50 of those children could be accounted for in the system. When Rivera asked Foster to provide current placement information for the missing children, she produced complex documentation showing they had been transferred between multiple facilities, adopted through private agencies, or had aged out of the system. But when Rivera attempted to verify these placements, he found that many of the facilities didn't exist. The adoption agencies were fronts with no actual operations, and the paperwork trail led to dead ends. Foster had created an elaborate bureaucratic maze designed to make it impossible to track where the children had actually been sent. The breakthrough came when Rivera discovered that Foster owned property through a series of shell companies. Multiple houses in rural areas that were supposedly used for therapeutic group homes, but had never been licensed or inspected by the state. When Rivera obtained warrants to search these properties, he found evidence of systematic child trafficking on a scale that dwarfed anything he had encountered in 20 years of police work. Foster hadn't been protecting children from abuse. She had been harvesting them from vulnerable families and feeding them into a network of buyers who paid premium prices for specific types of children. Her emergency removals were actually kidnappings carried out under the color of legal authority, using the child welfare system itself as a weapon against families who couldn't defend themselves. The investigation revealed Foster's sophisticated system for identifying targets. She focused on families that were socially isolated, financially struggling, or dealing with mental health issues. Parents who would have difficulty navigating the legal system to fight back against false allegations. She had perfected techniques for manufacturing evidence of abuse and neglect that would stand up to cursory review, but crumble under thorough investigation that these families couldn't afford. Foster's network included corrupt judges, attorneys, and other social workers who helped facilitate the trafficking operation. Children would be removed from their families based on Foster's fabricated reports, then quickly transferred through a series of temporary placements that made it impossible for parents or other authorities to track their whereabouts. Within weeks, the children would disappear entirely from official records. Rivera's investigation uncovered Foster's client list, a roster of buyers from around the world who had specific requirements for the children they wanted to purchase. Some buyers wanted children for sexual exploitation, others for forced labor, and some for even more disturbing purposes that Foster's encrypted communications only hinted at. She had been operating what amounted to a catalog service, matching specific children to buyers based on detailed psychological and physical profiles. The most horrifying aspect of Foster's operation was how she had weaponized the genuine desire to protect children. Parents who tried to fight back against false allegations were characterized as uncooperative and potentially dangerous, which only strengthened the case for permanent removal of their children. The very system designed to protect families had been turned into a predatory mechanism for destroying them. Foster had developed elaborate psychological profiles of the families she targeted, studying their vulnerabilities and designing specific strategies for each case. She knew which families could be broken through financial pressure, which ones through social isolation, and which ones through psychological manipulation that made them appear unstable to outside observers. Foster had developed elaborate psychological profiles of the families she targeted, studying their vulnerabilities and designing specific strategies for each case. She knew which families could be broken through financial pressure, which ones through social isolation, and which ones through psychological manipulation that made them appear unstable to outside observers. The investigation revealed that Foster's operation extended far beyond individual trafficking. She had been conducting systematic studies on child psychology, documenting which types of trauma produced the most compliant victims for different types of buyers. Children were subjected to specific conditioning programs designed to make them more suitable for their intended purposes. Rivera discovered that Foster maintained detailed records of every child she had trafficked, including updates on their condition and treatment in their final placements. She had been treating the systematic destruction of families and exploitation of children as a business operation, complete with customer satisfaction surveys and repeat buyer incentives. The scope of Foster's network became clear when Rivera found evidence of similar operations in 17 other states, all coordinated through a sophisticated communication system that allowed traffickers to share resources and transfer children across state lines. Foster had been part of a national conspiracy that had been operating for over 2 decades, using child protective services as a front for systematic child trafficking. When Rivera finally arrested Foster, she was in the process of removing 3 siblings from a family she had targeted based on an anonymous tip that she had fabricated herself. The children, ages 6, 8, and 10, were scheduled to be transferred to buyers within 48 hours, with the youngest already sold to a client in Southeast Asia who specialized in purchasing very young children for purposes that Foster's communications only referred to as extreme conditioning. Foster's personal residence contained a sophisticated operation center with surveillance equipment, communication systems, and detailed files on hundreds of families she was monitoring for potential targeting. She had been studying families throughout the region, identifying which ones had children that would be valuable to her network and developing long-term strategies for manufacturing reasons to remove those children. The investigation revealed that Foster had been using legitimate child welfare concerns as cover for her trafficking operation. She would identify families that had real but minor problems, financial stress, single parenthood, or behavioral issues with children, then systematically escalate those situations to create justification for removal. She had turned the normal challenges of parenting into weapons against vulnerable families. During her trial, Foster maintained that she had been protecting children from abusive situations and claimed that the families she had targeted were genuinely dangerous to their children. She produced elaborate documentation to support her claims, but investigators found that much of this evidence had been fabricated or manipulated to create false narratives that justified her actions. The most devastating revelation came when investigators realized that hundreds of families had been destroyed based on Foster's false allegations, while the children she claimed to be protecting had been delivered into situations far worse than anything they had experienced at home. Parents who had lost their children to Foster's system discovered that their beloved sons and daughters had been sold to buyers who specialized in the most extreme forms of child exploitation. The Foster case revealed how easily the child welfare system could be corrupted by someone who understood its vulnerabilities and was willing to exploit the genuine desire to protect children. Foster had weaponized society's commitment to child protection, turning it into a mechanism for systematic family destruction and child trafficking that operated with legal authority and institutional support.